Okay, ladies, this week we're going to be talking about the idol of bitterness. When I was 21 years old, my brother-in-law told me that he thought I was a pretty bitter person. And I was actually super shocked by this. I didn't see myself that way at all, but I had some pretty deep hurts in the last couple of years leading up to that time. And I think I had allowed a seed of bitterness to be planted in me, and I was really starting to fester that. So I realized he was right and I had some work to do. And so today we're going to talk about that, and I hope maybe this video helps you if you're in that place to see how you can work through some of those things. Bitterness is a prolonged anger toward someone or perhaps something that has happened to you. That anger can breed a lot of hostility, a lot of resentment in our hearts, and it can pervade our entire lives if we let it. And sometimes our bitterness is really well hidden. Sometimes we quietly fester. Sometimes we don't allow others to know, and we're pretty good at putting on the right face. But other times we might be pretty outspoken people, and we wave it around like a flag. We post on social media. We talk to everybody about this thing that's happened to us, this horrible event or whatever it was, and so our bitterness is more obvious. But regardless, whether it's out there for the world to see or whether you're silently carrying it with you, it can be a killer. It can be a silent killer in your soul if you allow it to, if we let it enter our lives and take root. So let's talk about how we can uproot bitterness. Bitterness is a drug that we choose to console ourselves. So why do we choose bitterness when we know that it's not good for us? Well, the truth is, bitterness is like a drug. It fuels us inside. The more we think about this event, the more justified we feel in our anger. And perhaps we are justified in some ways. Perhaps what's been done to us is pretty atrocious and we're justified to feel angry for a time. But the more we dwell on it, the more we allow those thoughts to take hold of us, the more we're able to push down the real problems, which might be hurt or pain that we need to go through, that we need to deal with, that we need to recognize. And as we deal with these thoughts of bitterness, we are building a wall that blocks us from seeing life as it really is, and perhaps we're denying parts that we had in the process of whatever had happened, or denying any blame or responsibility that we should be taking. So bitterness really can kind of numb us and console us in ways that it shouldn't be, acting like a drug to this problem that we've had. So in this way, bitterness becomes an idol in our lives. The more we're concerned about just thinking through these bitter thoughts and these angry thoughts, the less we want to think about what God has to say on the subject. We want to feel our own righteous anger and our own thoughts about it rather than really listen to what God has to say about how to work through this thing that's happened in our lives. So it becomes an idol in our lives, and we need to deal with that idol. That takes us to point number 2. The Bible warns us about the root of bitterness. The Bible has a really interesting analogy to use for bitterness. It talks about a root. Roots are an interesting way to talk about it. So let's look at a couple of verses that have to do with bitterness, and then we'll talk about this analogy. Ephesians 4:31 says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior." That verse is pretty interesting because as you look at it, it's kind of like a crescendo. Bitterness is leading to these other things, anger and rage and hateful words that are coming out of our mouths. Because we've allowed bitterness to start, it leads us to really bad places. And now let's look at Hebrews. Hebrews 12:15 says, "Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many." Think about that image of a root taking hold. I don't know if you've ever had a yard that you've had to keep nice, but oh my goodness, trying to keep grass green is a headache sometimes, to be honest. This year, morning glories have taken over my yard and my garden, my vegetable garden, which I love very much. And they root down deep under the grass, under the vegetables. They get their roots way deep. And so you might be able to pull out tops of them, but the roots are way down underneath, and it's impossible to get them all out. I'm learning. I'm very frustrated with this whole process, but it's made me think about this. Bitterness can be the same way. The roots can go down deep. So even if we act like we're fine on the outside, we're slowly growing a really poisonous plant in our souls that we need to deal with. So that leads us to our next point. The cure for bitterness is forgiveness. The only way to uproot bitterness out of our souls is to learn to forgive. And this can be a very hard process. I know we've all had to walk through some of this, and it can be extremely difficult, but true forgiveness is the only way to get bitterness out of our hearts. If you've carried bitterness around for a long time, You can only imagine how freeing it would be to not have those feelings of anger, of resentment, of hatred inside of you. How freeing it would be to not waste your energy constantly thinking about or getting frustrated over these old thoughts and old feelings. We need to learn that freedom, and that freedom comes through forgiveness. And think about it this way, who is benefiting from your bitterness? Bitterness doesn't actually produce any kind of change. It hurts us, it hurts our souls, it brings us in a constant state of anxiety and pain and can lead to depression, and yet it doesn't benefit us at all, and it doesn't cause any change for the other person. It doesn't cause any change in the person who's offended us. So bitterness does no good. The only solution is forgiveness. And God modeled the forgiveness that we need perfectly in Jesus Christ. Jesus understood what it was like to be wronged. He was wronged in so many ways, and yet he showed how we can actually provide true forgiveness to someone who's wronged us. He is the perfect example of that. So let's look at these verses. Romans 5:6-8 says, "When we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners." Now, most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. God chose to forgive us while we were still sinning. In those moments when we were still ignoring him, when we were still totally wanting to do our own thing and not caring what he had to say about it, in that moment, he chose to come and forgive us. And not just forgive us with words, but prove it on a cross. Do the hardest thing that anyone could ever do and go die for us to help provide that forgiveness for us. So he completely understands when we're struggling with forgiveness, but also he shows us how to do it. We need to be willing to forgive the way Christ does. So our last point is cleanse yourself from the idol of bitterness. Bitterness really is a poisonous drug that can plant itself in our lives and take over. And so we need to rip it out. And it's a hard and perhaps long process, but it's something we need to do as we walk with Christ and not allow this root to be an idol in our lives. So we've talked about the cleanse, this 4-step process, the cleanse every week. And I really encourage you to look at the cleanse in day 3 of the homework for this week. And if this is a problem in your life right now, if you're really struggling with this, with a root of bitterness that's taken place in your life, I really encourage you to look at the cleanse this week and start working through it. And you might need to go over it and over it and over it several times to get through this cleanse and to feel like bitterness really is released from your life. But it will be so worth it. I remember when I was struggling, those early 20s, I had a situation that I was having such a hard time letting go of, and I realized I had to choose every time a person came into my mind. I had to choose, as that person entered my mind, I would talk to God and I'd say, okay, Lord, I'm choosing to say, you get to take care of this situation and I won't. Lord, I choose to forgive them the way that you forgave me. Now help me. And then I'd move my thoughts, and I memorized a few key verses at that time, and I moved my thoughts to those verses every time. And it took months. It took months of reminding myself over and over again. But I really was able to completely release that situation within a few months and move past a lot of bitterness in my life to become a much freer person. So we really want to see that in your life as well, ladies. Take the time to go over this cleanse process and see how it can really change your life.